Dr. David Johnson was lead editor of one of the early books analyzing San Antonio's internal workings, The Politics of San Antonio, Community, Progress, and Power, published by University of Nebraska Press in 1982. He received his PhD in urban history at the University of Chicago and taught at the University of Texas at San Antonio for 37 years. He retired in 2012 and later moved to North Carolina. Much of his research has focused on the history of law enforcement and crime and on the political economy of urban development. His publications also include Policing the Urban Underworld, American Law Enforcement, and this is a fun one, Illegal Tender, Counterfeiting and the Secret Service in 19th century America. His insights today are drawn from the book he is currently working on, a long-needed, thorough history of San Antonio, this one from the economic development standpoint, and he will have some insights that I'm sure none of us has ever heard in San Antonio, and we look forward to welcoming David Johnson.
Is this thing necessary? Okay, just checking. I don't want to bite it, and since I woke up at 1:30 this morning and didn't get back to sleep, if I start to nod off, maybe this will help interrupt me, keep me upright. Today I'm going to talk about what has been, in my case, about a 35-year passion or interest in the history of San Antonio and the way this city developed. I came from the University of Chicago, where there were very decided ideas about the way cities develop. There were all kinds of theories, and as I applied those things to San Antonio, they kept slipping off because they just didn't work, which is highly irritating because theory is always supposed to be explaining everything, and in this case it just wasn't explaining very much at all, which to me turned out to be an interesting intellectual challenge. So I got engaged in trying to figure this out while I was busily writing books on cops and robbers. This was my hobby on the side. So today is a report on my hobby and where I am and where I might be going. What I'd like to do is give you a very brief overview of what people tried to do in this city to develop the city and make it grow. I'm going to be talking about examples over time where some of this you may not have heard at all. Some of it may be cast differently than you've heard. I hope it is. The idea is that I want to stimulate discussion. I would very much like to be able to give you more than 10 minutes for Q&A. But since I am an historian and a professional blabberer, I may not be able to do that even, so we'll see. So I'd like to begin by giving just a little bit of an anticipation of what's to come. Urban development is, when you look at it across all the examples, urban development is one of those things that every city does. The name these people have is usually boosters. It's a 19th century term. These days, booster sounds kind of odd in the modern lingo of urban development, so we have other words for these people. They're called growth machines, for example. And most of the time, these days, you will encounter the booster mentality in people who are professional staff people at City Hall. Their job is to engage in helping the city become better than it is. And that, by definition, is what a booster was trying to do. Mostly through history, boosters are either politicians or businessmen. They are also attorneys. Turns out people who practice the law have a lot of time on their hands, so they go into these kinds of activities. And over San Antonio's history, there have been a variety of booster organizations that I want to talk about. And the other part of this, though, is I want you to be aware of a very important aspect of this. Boosters usually have opposition. There are a lot of people in every city who think this kind of activity is useless. And they are opposed to it for a variety of reasons. San Antonio has its own version of the anti-booster mentality. So let us begin. The first example I want to discuss has to do with one of our most famous citizens. His name is Maverick. This was a revelation to me when I discovered what he was doing. I'm not going to bother giving you his biography, because if you don't know it, you don't belong in this room. But in this particular case, this is a very interesting example of something I've never seen in any biography of him or an even side comment about him. He organized a booster coalition in San Antonio in 1850. And this booster coalition lasted until 1855, where it died of its own incompetence. But I'll get back to that. This was a really interesting group of people, small. Booster groups are usually small. His core group was about 7 people. And to give you a clue about what is going to happen here, not a single one of those people was a businessman. Remember I said most boosters are business people or politicians. So we have a group of people who are attorneys and land speculators. One of them is the, what do they call him, the Indian agent for the state of Texas in 1850. And these are all people who are going to invest their time, because they don't have a lot of money, in doing something to help the city grow. It's a very interesting idea because it's very comprehensive. They were going to have urban amenities. They had talked about putting trees on Main Plaza, and they talked about putting in public schools. They talked about parks. San Pedro Park is the result of this kind of thing. And they also wanted to industrialize the town. They talked about the river as an industrial corridor. They described it in typical booster terms as it was going to be the next Lawrence. It would be the Lawrence of the South. You know, Lawrence, New Jersey, was a big industrial area where industrialization began in the north. It involved bringing in new ideas for experimentation. They were going to import cotton seeds to make cotton grow in this area. They were responsible for introducing sheep. They organized one of the first cattle drives I've encountered, not from the Spanish period. They were driving cattle in the Spanish period, but in this period, in the 1850s, there was a group of cattle assembled on Military Plaza heading for California. I have no idea if they made it. Given the odds that this one, I don't think they got out of Texas, but never mind, they were trying. The centerpiece of what they were doing was the San Antonio and Mexican Gulf Railroad. They proposed to build a railroad to the coast to solve the city's single most important problem, which was its isolation, geographical isolation. This railroad is going to cause them endless grief. The way you build railroads back then is you've got to get public money, and what they did was they organized, they got San Antonio to vote for $500,000 in railroad bonds. Then they got the county to give them $500,000 in railroad bonds. So that's a fairly impressive amount of money for the time. And they are going to do this route. One of the problems is they don't know where on the coast they're going to end it. And it's important for them that they don't go, of course, to Galveston. Galveston is a rival city. You don't put a railroad into Galveston and do them a favor of making them the beneficiary of the railroad. So where they're going to put it on the coast turned out to be a big problem. Nevertheless, the short way this thing goes, it's a really interesting and elaborate effort. The railroad is never built because they don't know how to do it. They keep trying to figure out how to get it done. They have bad luck selling the bonds, which means they don't have a lot of money all the time. And they actually hired Albert Sidney Johnston to be the railroad engineer at one point. Their fatal problem with where was it going to end up on the coast, they decided they weren't going to end up at Port Aransas or Indianola. They picked an island where nobody was living that was owned by land speculators, and announced that that was going to be the terminus of the railroad. And there were people in Port Aransas and Indianola and Victoria who were outraged by that, and they all withdrew their subscriptions to the railroad, increasing the financial problems they were facing. Then they had to deal with the fact that while you've got the railroad bonds, you also have to pay them back, which means you have to tax. And so they control the city council, which is a part of the Booster Coalition. They control the politics, they control the economy, and they pass a railroad tax. And oddly enough, San Antonians refused to pay it. In fact, they got really mad about the railroad tax because they wanted to see the railroad before they paid for it. That's kind of nice. And they didn't get it. So the railroad tax became a political problem for them. And then there was this little deal with land speculation. They believed that San Antonio was going to grow like a bandit because of their efforts. And they were all land speculators. Maverick owned a lot of land already. All these people owned land. But they arranged a public sale of San Antonio's land in order to prepare the way. The speculators were going to buy the land and prepare it for the incoming crowds of thousands of people. And there is some justice to this, because when they put the land up for sale, all the speculators bought land on the west side of the river. They believed the west side of the river would be where the town grew up. The east side, they ignored. Now, the railroad is actually going to come in and locate its terminus on the east side in 1877, when we finally get one. So one of the nice things about, the wheels of God grinding justly here is the speculators buy on the wrong side of town, literally. Now, they can recover because after all, they own so much, it's going to be all right. In the meantime, their coalition falls apart because of the speculation deal. They arranged special terms for themselves so that they could buy land at 10% down and repay the 90% they were due, they owed the city, over 50 years. That's a very sweet deal. So the people who own the land now control the city government and are not building the railroad. Taxpayers look at this and they call this disappointment, right? So the coalition loses power, actually loses power to the know-nothings in the city elections of 54 and 55, city and county, and so they're thrown out of power. Now, this has consequences. This is really long-term consequences, because the way they behaved and the failures they had, they generated opposition to the idea of organized development by businessmen and politicians. So one long-term consequence here is that tax revolt I mentioned, things like that. The voters are going to be very, very unhappy at the prospect of any kind of urban development project that costs them money. The other thing is the business community is not interested in boosterism. And this is because of the military. The military is just getting going, of course, in the 1850s, but it is handing out very nice contracts. And if you're a freighter, and most of the business elite of this time period are freighters, if you're a freighter, you don't have to do anything more than fill out the paperwork, and you get a contract. And they're nice contracts. One example, a shipload of goods coming from Baltimore, for which the United States government paid, I think it was $5,000. Shipment came from Baltimore, landed on the Texas coast, came to San Antonio, was distributed to the fort system. That one shipment of goods, the contract for it totaled $90,000 in shipping costs. That's $1,855. I don't know how to translate that right now if anybody's got a calculator, but that's a lot of money, and that's one contract. So the military if you're looking at this in economic theory terms, the military acts as a depressant to economic initiatives in town because you don't need to do anything. The military is bringing in all the money. It's a very interesting problem. It's the overdominance of a particular aspect of the economy which discourages people from thinking about other ways to develop the economy, which is going to be very powerful until the 1870s in this town. So that was the first booster coalition. Didn't work very well.
I'm sorry to cut you, but well, if the freighters were not rails, which they weren't, could you just describe what freighters were for all of us?
Oh, well, a freighting company owns wagons. What we have here is oxen running, carrying the goods. They're slow, but they're reliable, and they can pull a lot of weight. And so we have the problem with some of this is, you don't have a lot of good data, but there's roughly 10 to 15 freighting companies in town, and they seem to have subsidiary partnerships, sometimes with Mexican-American freighters who have been engaged in this kind of activity for decades, hauling goods back and forth from the coast. So that's the freighting business is a core of the economy, had been for many, many years. Okay, any other questions? Okay, moving on to the next episode. We get a railroad in 1877, and it was a close run thing, I should point out. Remember, the memory of the SA and MG Railroad is lingering, and it lingers because the railroad tax is still being paid. The railroad's dead. The bonds are still there. We sold them. A federal judge ruled that we had to pay back the bonds. So even into the 1870s, San Antonio is collecting a railroad tax on a railroad that doesn't exist. This is not good advertising for the railroad that does arrive in town. So when the Galveston, Harrisburg, and San Antonio Railroad comes in, Thomas Pierce, who's the owner, wants a subsidy, and he demands a subsidy from San Antonio, and San Antonians basically are not interested in that darn idea. So they have an election, and it's something on the order of 5,000 votes are cast. The boosters in this case got organized, and it's a good thing they did, because the election approved of the the subsidy for the railroad by a majority of 28 votes out of 5,000 cast. This is called suspicion that this is not going to work. Now, of course, the railroad does arrive. Now, this is supposed to be the greatest moment in the history of San Antonio, because in the American West of the 19th century, the arrival of the railroad makes the town. If your railroad doesn't come, you're dead. And we almost shot ourselves. Now, it's here. So the idea is now is the time for another booster coalition to come into play and really push for all kinds of economic development. It doesn't work because in 1878, within 1 year, I shouldn't put it this way, but I will, the German business community organizes something called the Taxpayers Association. And this is a top-down organization which is organized to oppose public investment in urban development. And the association will lobby the legislature for an amendment to the city charter, reduce the bonded limitation on the city. You can only issue $10,000 a year in bonds. You have to get it approved by 2/3 majority vote every time you issue a bond or try to get a bond. And a funny thing happens when they put that charter amendment in, the city's credit collapses on the New York bond market. We can't raise money for squat. And the association issues a public statement which says that the association reserves the right to determine public policy with regard to internal improvements. In other words, a private organization is going to tell the city council whether it can or cannot do anything to improve the city. Now, 1 year after the railroad, you get this. What it does is it really eviscerates any effort at boosterism. So what are you left with? Well, you're left with what I'm currently doing. It's called coughing, you may have noticed. Consumption. Texas had been known as a place for consumptives to come and be cured since the 1840s. San Antonio, for reasons I'm not clear about, had developed a reputation as being one of the best places to come if you were consumptive. And so the tourism business begins. This is the origin of tourism. We're going to cough our way to success. Now, this is a little hazardous because consumptives it's tuberculosis, and of course it's fatal in the 19th century. But the thinking here is among the boosters, well, consumptives have to travel for their health if they're going to do anything about their disease or not. Who travels in the 19th century? Only the upper classes. So what we got here is people who are dying, but they got money. So if they'll come to town and we show them a good time, they will invest in San Antonio. This is a little tricky because if they come in and they die, you don't get the money, and it's not good PR because you guaranteed them they're going to be cured, So it's a tricky thing. But consumption is the primary justification for tourism in San Antonio until the 1890s. And it does evolve, and it does change the city. We begin to get restaurants, we begin to get more hotels. In other words, businessmen begin to cater to this group of people. We have no idea how many of them there are. I found an early estimate in the 1880s that there were 20,000 people a year coming to town. 20,000 consumptives is a health hazard, particularly when the town is about 30,000 people. I don't believe the number, but what the guy was saying basically is there's a whole lot of people in town. You see them in the public squares, you see them in the hotels. They're hacking their way through town. It's a pleasant kind of image that you think about. So, as I say, this is the only thing that's organized economic activity of any sort. It is very minimal kind of activity. But again, it teaches the business community the idea that you don't have to do anything very much to promote growth because A, you got all these consumptives coming to town, presumably spending money. B, the town is growing. So you have, that post-hoc, Proctor-Hope thing. If the growth is going on and you want growth and you're not doing anything about it, well, do you have to do anything about it? No, you don't. So you develop the habit of thinking in the business community that is reinforced by the experience with the Maverick failures. It's just reinforcing the idea that you don't need to do this kind of development stuff actively. In 1895, we get an ambitious group of people who hadn't lived in town before. They mostly have come in the period after about 1885. And again, a lot of them are attorneys and other professional people, business managers and whatnot, cashiers of local banks. And they found an organization called the Businessmen's Association, the Businessmen's Club. Dedicated to what? First dedication, we are going to attract investors to San Antonio to invest their money. In other words, we're not going to invest our money. They're going to come to town and invest their money. Second objective, we are going to become the health capital of the United States. Consumption again. So that's 1895, that's January. Later that spring, a group of doctors come to the city council and make a public announcement that science has discovered that consumption is contagious. Now that's a kick in the head, So what do? The first thing you do is to deny it. You get your doctors in town to say, no, it's not contagious. So we can continue with this idea. Well, the fact is, very quickly, the word spreads, and San Antonians begin to think that we don't want consumptives around. We turn very unfriendly to these people hacking their way through town. So now what you're going to do, if you're a businessman club member, you're building the idea of San Antonio's future on tourism, but your number one idea is now discredited. So the Businessmen's Club has to find a way to build tourism as an industry not based on disease. This is going to take them to about 1910. And what they do is they experiment. And since I haven't got a lot of time, I'll just cut this quick. What they do is they invent, in 1900, they invent Carnival. By 1905, they organize officially into the Spring Carnival Association. Carnival becomes a good way to attract membership to the club. It grows, it had about 400 members in 1900. By 1910, it's about 1,600. Pretty impressive. All due to the fact that they've organized, they are identified in the public mind with Carnival and what we will eventually call Fiesta. And in doing so, they are now beginning to organize tourism in a slightly different way with a different focus. It's going to be conventions. They pair convention invitations with dates where they're going to have carnival. So when the carnival is in town, so are most of the conventions. This is the way they tried to, the ratcheted effect here is to get more conventions into town by attaching them to carnival. And it works kind of, it's okay, but they're still focused on this idea about the rich investor. And they're going to transform that person from a consumptive into a snowbird. This is the period when you begin to get the snowbird phenomenon. This is when they begin to talk about how we need to attract these people. They're going to be healthy now, thank God. So we're going to have to, treat them right. So what they do is they create, in 1910, they build the Travis Club. It's a 6-story skyscraper down in the downtown, devoted to, it's actually an athletic club, but what they're doing is they're reserving the top floors of this for these snowbirds who come to town. They'll be feted. There's going to be, meals prepared for them. They're going to arrange dances for these people. This is also when what do these rich people want to do? Well, they want to shoot things. So hunting. This is when hunting and fishing becomes an important part of tourism. Golf becomes an important part of tourism. Golf is a national phenomenon, of course, but here in San Antonio, you begin to see golf clubs springing up, starting about this time period. And this is when, the nature of tourism is rooted on snowbirds and conventions in this city. I should point out that this is not something that's new or innovative in terms of other cities. Atlanta's been doing this. Atlanta is much better at this than we are at this time. Other cities are much better we're kind of late bloomers on this stuff. But we keep trying, we push it. By the 1920s, it gets very elaborate. You may have heard of something called the Canopus Club, which is a club founded in 1921, still exists. Its official statement of purpose is, we don't do anything useful. But they're very useful because they are the official greeters, the meeting and greeting people for the snowbirds. They organize the concerts, they organize the dinners, they organize the dances. They take them around out shooting things and whatever. And so you get this very interesting evolution of tourism into a pretty elaborate industry in town. We begin to build more hotels. This is when the St. Anthony comes in, the Gunther, et cetera. There's a couple of problems with this. Tourism is changing in its nature because of the automobile. By the 1920s, you're going to get families touring around who are not rich. They're not snowbirds. They're just going around the countryside seeing the country. And they're going to become important in the 1920s. We take care of them with Breckenridge Park. We convert Breckenridge Park into essentially a trailer camp for tourists. Not the whole thing, but they build cabins in there. You know, they put in the zoo, they put in the swimming facilities, all kinds of stuff. Breckenridge Park is one heck of an operation. It's run by one of San Antonio's most famous corrupt politicians. His name is Ray Lambert. He was one of the 5 commissioners who ran the town. He's a wonderful guy. A saloon keeper, yeah. Crooked, well, you know, in the corrupt way he keeps winning elections, yeah. But he turns out to be honorary president of the Conservation Society. Somebody must like him. So he is the man who transforms Breckenridge Park into a major tourist attraction for us. Now, you know, what's missing here? What have I not talked about? Can't hear. The Riverwalk. And? I was going to be ashamed of you all. The Alamo. Where's the Alamo in all this? It ain't. 1938 is when that darn thing opens up. The Alamo is more in the imagination of a few fervid people as a potential tourist attraction than it is an actual tourist attraction. There are people coming to look at the Alamo. I've seen the letters in the newspapers. Outrage at how small the damn thing is. It isn't, you know, it's, why are we to come all this way? To what? Look at that. And, you know, the Riverwalk, clearly not there yet. That's the 1930s. They are beautifying the river. There's a strong awareness of the river. There's a strong urge to protect the river. And Lewis has explained that in great detail in his wonderful books. But it's not the Riverwalk that we know at this point. So this is the, you know, basically, there are other booster elements going into developing the city at this time. In fact, the boosters create their own political machine in 1914. And what they do is they invest in infrastructure. They are tinkering with some stuff with the river, but they're also building lots and lots of streets. This town had a lot of unpaved streets. Like 80% of them were unpaved at the time. So there's massive efforts to use bond money to pave streets. There's a lot of money put into building some drainage, and there's a fair amount of money put into sewers. But it's all kind of spotty. And you'll have to read my book to get the definitive account of it anyway. So, so this is the focus of economic development in this town in the period from 1895 through, well, the eruption of World War II is going to cause some problems. So let's say World War II is tourism. Now, remember I said there's opposition. The opposition to this kind of stuff does continue. Now, tourism is safe because you don't have to, as individuals, be worried about it if you live in San Antonio. You don't have to, as a San Antonian, invest in it. There's no taxes being levied on you until 1927, when the Chamber of Commerce fails to find enough money to pay the advertising bills for tourism. And so the city council imposes a tax of 3 cents per resident for advertising the city of San Antonio. Just a little sidebar there. And that was done by the machine. The machine that I inadequately described exists from 1914 to 1952. It's called the commission machine. Its reputation is that it's this corrupt organization run by professional politicians that must be replaced. It originated as a booster machine that the boosters ran for most of that time frame. They just didn't get the press the right way. So, where am I in my time? How am I doing? 10 minutes before the question period? 15. We'll have to argue about this. All right, so I do want to talk about one missed opportunity. 1939, which I still am trying to figure out because the explanation for this literally does not make sense. The printed record offers an explanation which is ungrammatical and nonsensical, but in 1939, FDR is building up the nation's war-making potential, manufacturing, going big time. Aircraft manufacturing is a big part of that. The federal government is investing hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars in this stuff. And in 1939, Mayor Maverick, we'll get back to a hero part here, asked the Secretary of Commerce to accompany him to Kansas City to look at a new aircraft manufacturing plant that they have just gotten from the federal government. And they go make the trip to come back. Maverick, remember, this is a New Deal politician who's well known to FDR, has good connections with the federal government, and the government is giving away the money anyway. The deal is, you want an aircraft plant? The federal government will pay the entire construction cost. You want a skilled labor force? The federal government will train all the workers at their cost. They will then give you contracts, they're called cost-plus contracts, to build aircraft for the United States government. This is called such a deal. So the secretary comes back, Maverick says, what are we going to do? And the secretary of the Chamber of Commerce says, and this is, I cannot replicate this, it doesn't make any sense. He says, essentially, San Antonio is dedicated to training military personnel. We should not do this. What does Dallas do? 6 businessmen get on a plane, they fly to California, they go to Boeing, they convince Boeing to bring a plant to Dallas, and it's the first of 5. It's the basis of Dallas's manufacturing power. It is the basis of Dallas's electronics industry. It is the basis of Dallas beating the hell out of us as a bigger and better city than we are. And our Secretary of the Chamber said, no. In the panoply of stupidity, this ranks very high. So what are we going to do to recover from that? Well, we're going to get to the GGL. I have to admit, I have a lot of trouble with the GGL, trying to figure out what their intentions were, because the intention originally was not a booster coalition idea at all. The intention was to rid the city of corrupt politicians through reforming the structure of city government, i.e. creating city manager government. It was an idea of Walter McAllister's, one of the sterling businessmen in the history of this city, who got this bug very early, 1930s, when he launched his campaign, and he kept at it for 24 years until he finally won. They changed the structure of government, and when they start going initially, 1952, 1954, it is very unclear what the heck they're going to do with the power they now have acquired. They're very clear that they've gotten rid of the corrupt politicians, so now we have a bunch of amateurs. And believe me, they act like it. They can't get a motion on the floor because they don't know how to. They have no program that I can figure out. Now, 1954 is when the GGL formally gets organized and then gets into running the city for the next 20 years. And what they're doing, as near as I can tell, is problem solving. That is, there are incredibly difficult problems this city faces as a result of the Second World War, and also neglect of a lot of basic service issues. We have one of the worst slums in America on the west side. We have, which is showing up in Look magazine in 1950, and again in 1955. We have enormous infrastructure problems. I haven't got time to go into all the details about how that happened, but basically, the very fundamental structure of the city is in infrastructure is a mess. The city's population is not adequately served. The kinds of pipes are not the right sizes. The connections are not there. There are privies all over the place because there aren't sewer connections. The death rate from diseases is really frightening on the west side. So, you have major issues. So there is an effort to address those kinds of things in the bond issues that the GGL proposes. They had, addressed drainage. They addressed something about the pipes, the water pipes, and things like that. What I want to talk about just briefly, and they have 3 major projects which could be classified as booster projects. They are, of course, Hemisphere, then there's the medical center, and then there's UTSA. Now, all 3 of these things are transformative, and that's where they can fit into the booster idea. But except for Hemisphere, which is a special case thing, the first 2 are proposed to solve immediate problems which are narrowly defined. They are not recognized as having the potential to build a city. So, for example, let's take UTSA, since I spent 37 years there. UTSA is not, it doesn't spring forth as a 4-year institution from the get-go. The origins of UTSA are in the business community's desire to find some advanced training for engineers. They don't want a university, they just want courses. Now, I once wrote a 50-page paper on this for the president, and so it's a little complicated. But essentially, that idea gets caught up in Governor Connolly's dedication to higher education as a way to grow the Texas economy. He understands the connection between higher education research institutions and urban development and prosperity for the state. Local people don't get that. And so you have this conflict going on where Connolly will come in, just drop in and say, okay, for example, he will say in the mid-'60s all of a sudden, okay, we're going to give San Antonio a 4-year institution, and we're going to make it a technical college. Its emphasis will be technology. Then we get 1969, what do we get? A university of the first class, which the coordinating board promptly shuts down and defines as a commuter campus which will never be bigger than 8,000 students and will never offer any advanced degrees that will promote urban development. Now, they don't say it that way, but that's what happens. I'm not bitter, you understand. It's just, but it's an example. Yeah, UTSA is a very interesting example of this problem where the GGL is supporting something that's going to turn out to be a really good idea, but they don't seem to get the point. And that's where my problem with them as boosters is they don't seem to be quite as aware of what they're doing in terms of general development as they are aware of specific problems that need solutions. The Health Science Center is the same way. Hemisphere, they missed a great opportunity. Poor David Strauss was running the Riverwalk Committee of the Chamber of Commerce basically by himself, and he was having a tough time. When I looked at his papers, the first thing I saw when I opened the first folder, there was a note from his secretary of a phone call. And the phone call was, there's some people who want to talk to you about your idea of converting property on the Riverwalk into, tourist kinds of attractions. What was the objection? They're concerned that their taxes are going to go up. Now think about that. Businessmen who own the center of the city, the most valuable land, are afraid their taxes are going to go up if they improve the damned land. That's a really an astonishing attitude. It goes all the way back to the Taxpayers Association mentality. And Strauss is struggling, trying to get that done. So what does he do? He wrote a letter to the head of the Hemisphere group, Marshall Steves, in which he said, you're working on Hemisphere, which is, oddly enough, right next door to the Riverwalk, right? And I'm working on the Riverwalk. We have common interests. Let's cooperate. Marshall Steves writes back to him, no, we don't. End of story. Now, the idea of cooperation would have helped both of them, and it would have sure helped Strauss with his Riverwalk project, because he's going to take another 10 years before the Riverwalk that we know as the Riverwalk really takes off. I mean, the man was incredibly dedicated, and as far as I can tell, incredibly lonely for a long time in terms of getting the help he needed. So we missed an opportunity there. Hemisphere was a great success in terms of advertising the city and making it into something that other people never thought of in terms of San Antonio. It's a great PR success. But there's a really important problem that we missed there. Since I'm running out of time, yes, let me just say one or two words about the most successful booster coalition that has ever existed in the history of this city, which of course is Cisneros and General McDermott. I don't have enough time to talk about that, but what I want to say about it is that these days there has been a lot of talk about building the creative city. You've had somebody come to town named Richard Florida, a sociologist who's an expert on creativity, who wrote a book about the creative class. Let me just tell you up front, I don't know what the hell he's talking about, because I don't know what he means by creative. Creative is one of those terms that sounds really good and has very little substance. The definitive book on creative cities was written by a man named Peter Hall. It's called Cities and Civilization. It's about 1,200 pages long. He spent all that time trying to figure out what the heck creativity was. So he looked at Florence for the Renaissance. He looked at London for underground sewers. In other words, creativity is all kinds of things. Then in the end, he wrote an article. This is the man who wrote the book on creative cities. He wrote an article about creative cities in which he said, I don't know what they are. So what is creativity and where does it really come from? Well, in my opinion, the Cisneros-McDermott effort at boosterism established the basis for a creative city. What is, in my opinion, a creative city is one which is prepared to work in an organized civic way to promote the betterment of the city and all of its citizens. Creativity it's organic. You cannot get Richard Ford to come in here and bless you and say you're creative. You have to develop it yourself. And what happens with McDermott and Cisneros through first United San Antonio and then Target 90 is that they organize the community to participate in urban development systematically and enthusiastically. That is the definition of what you need for creativity to occur. There's no way to predict what the creative solution is going to be for this city of whatever type. We're doing pretty well on cybersecurity, for example. Where did that come from? It didn't come from outside. It came from inside when all those colonels from the U.S. Air Force were let go in the reorganization of the armed forces in the 1970s and early 80s, and they stayed in San Antonio and they founded companies, computer companies. You have spin-off coming from the Health Science Center. You have what I call Silicon Creek, which is located west of I-10, between the medical center and Wurzbach. You go back in there and you drive in there and there's all these little companies. That's creativity. That's where it comes from. It's coming from the organic development of the city. And it produces, people slowly get to this. I mean, have you ever heard of David Spencer? Some of you may not. He founded a computer company. He sold it, founded another one, sold it. That's what he sold it for $40 million, I think it was. The man's an entrepreneur. He was a former colonel. He's now an entrepreneur, still running around the city. The people, you find these people, you cannot predict they're going to come, but we have created the environment in which they can exist and thrive. And that is one of the ultimate benefits of organized attention to booster ideas. Am I out? I'm out.
Thank you very much for a most insightful cybersecurity has been quite a journey. in a very wonderful way, and I'm sure have left dozens of questions out there. Who would like to be first in the questions? Back.
You hit on cybersecurity, but I don't know what politicians other than Henry B. Gonzalez was very, very instrumental in keeping Fort Sam in its role. And then with the medical situation at Fort Sam and all the armed forces at Fort Sam and Randolph and military city San Antonio. And cybersecurity is military too.
Yes, it is.
I mean, these things happened because we did have a presence here, and military is a big, big part of it.
Yeah, I don't disagree with that at all. The remarks I made about the military that have to do with the 1850s have to do with the economic impact of having only one very, very large economic player in your playground. The military continued to be important until its mission was changed in the 1870s when it guaranteed the frontier, and the military was then reorganized. And in fact, from 1877 until about 1905, the military again was far less important in the economy than it had been. With World War I, World War II, especially World War II, you get the Cold War, the military reasserts its dominance in the local economy. The fact is, you can't, in a talk like this, I can't cover everything. I was trying to cover things that you might not have heard of, and and the impact of the military in a modern city is really focused around medical services. And the fact is, we almost lost BAMC in the 1980s because they were going to reorganize it out of San Antonio. And the man who saved that was Robert McDermott. So he organized the effort. I mean, there are other people involved, but McDermott was the man who led to that, because McDermott, as a former general, could call people no one else could call in the Pentagon and get their attention and get them to listen to what we wanted to say to them. So that was a huge shift for us when we say BAMC. Next.
Actually, my question was going to be about the military, so I've had to recalibrate real quickly here. Is there ever, I mean, you hear in talking with people that, well, Houston's too big and too busy. Dallas is too this, Dallas is that. San Antonio is a place to live. That seems to be sort of a big part of our civic identity.
Yeah.
How does that, is that a consequence of economic development, or do you think, or did that somehow arise to sort of justify not doing anything?
Oh, I could get in a lot of trouble with this one.
Thanks, I try.
Yes, you do. You succeed. I think that you could trace some of that attitude toward this early opposition I mentioned. For the Taxpayers Association, for example, in 1878. What's the difference between that and C.A. Stubbs in 1989? It's the same mentality about you don't want expensive projects that taxpayers have to pay for that are going to benefit the whole city. Now, the way you phrase that always ends up making it sound like those people are, embittered, nasty, anti-this, anti-that. What they're doing is they're defending a long tradition, a legitimate tradition in San Antonio of opposition based on cost. And also, I would have to say, based on American cultural behavioral patterns. After all, who trusts politicians? You can trace a lot of the debate that goes on in San Antonio about this kind of political arrangement or that one. It's the old Thomas Jefferson, Alexander Hamilton debate between active government and inactive government. And, so there's a lot of cultural baggage there. And going back to the point about San Antonio being a better place to live, it is. There's no doubt in my mind. Dallas, speaking as a totally professional historian in a completely neutral way, Dallas should not exist. There is no good reason. Go ahead.
And David, I'm going to wander around a little bit, but I'll try to keep it as short as possible.
I tried. I failed.
I was at a meeting just after Hemisphere, and it was called sort of think about the course that San Antonio ought to take now that the fair was over. The leadership in San Antonio was very poorly led, if it was led at all. And the meeting began without an agenda. It proceeded sporadically over a whole series of subjects. This was a big meeting, by the way, maybe 250 in the convention center.
Wow.
300 people.
Yeah.
There was no one taking notes. There was never any notes published. At the end of the meeting, it just drifted off. There was no one that said, we'll have another meeting someday, or not.
Yeah.
And that represented, I think, the fact that there had been really no leadership in San Antonio for a long time, and maybe there never was.
Yeah.
But what I thought about at the time was the fact that the basic fundamental economic underpinnings of the city were based upon the military, and at that time, even less than, much less than today, the military really stayed out of politics and stayed out of city development.
Yeah, they're supposed to.
So they didn't have any, they were the biggest enterprise, but they had no role in the city. Tourism had no real role in the city because they were gone, and there were just a few people that were serving their industry.
Yeah.
And so, in a sense, and manufacturing didn't really exist. So we didn't have any leadership, and we had no one to really pull things together. And as you said, Henry and Cisneros and McDermott and a few others began to pull things together in the mid-'80s. Well, that was 20 years later.
Yeah.
So it seems to me that almost the whole issue of San Antonio's development had been clouded by these structural flaws
Yeah.
in the city.
Yeah, when I started this work, tried to figure out what was going on, one of the things I kept looking back at was there's a failure to develop, which is a very important kind of failure to develop. It's called learning. That boosterism or any worthwhile activity is organized on around principles that involve learning how to do something. And what you look at, if you look at the way boosterism in this city has popped up and then disappeared and popped up again, what happens is there's no continuity between generations of boosters that allows them to hand on information, valuable lessons learned, things to avoid, how to do things. There's no continuity. And it becomes especially apparent, and as there's other things involved, but I look at this and think, all this stuff takes time. Boosterism takes time. You know, you're going to plant seeds today that 50 years from now will suddenly sprout, and you say, where'd that come from? It takes a lot of time. But it takes persistence as well, and the problem is we never had the persistence. You know, when McDermott came to town, he came to town because of Hemisphere. He told me he thought when he came, a town that can organize Hemisphere must know how to do development. Then he met the Chamber of Commerce. And he took him out to dinner, and he took him to a retreat. They went hunting. And he said they went to the hunting lodge. They got everybody unpacked. They gathered together at the main floor, at the big room, sat down and started playing cards and drinking. And they drank and they drank and they played and they played. And then they got up and went to bed. And McDermott said, he said, I said to someone, he said, wait a minute, we haven't done any planning. He said, tomorrow. Tomorrow they went out, they hunted. Then he went back and they drank. You know, McDermott was amazing personality. He was very driven and incredibly organized. And these people drove him nuts. And that's why he founded DDF. He wanted economic development for the city. He took economic development out of the Chamber of Commerce's area of responsibility and created the Economic Development Foundation. And only people who paid, you had to pay in to play. And the amount of money you put in determined how many votes you had at the table. And there were a whole lot of people in San Antonio who didn't either have the money or didn't want to play. So that was a very small group of people who started the EDF. And that's just the first step, and then there's all kinds of stuff. And you know, by the way, I didn't get a chance to talk about Lila. You know, Lila's actions as mayor from 1975 to 1981 saved this city. Just basically saved it from incredible discord. She put him on a path that made McDermott and Cisneros possible. It's just an amazing record for that woman.
David, we thank you very much. You have shown us why San Antonio is indeed such an amazing and unusual city with an endless array of fascinating subjects to dig into, and we're very grateful for your sharing them with us this morning. Thank you.
Thank you.